Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans podcast starts right now.
All right, welcome back to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. Gus Kattengell, Jim Eichenhofer, Pelicans.com with you as we continue our player profiles. JRE, you're on deck, Sir Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, as we're going to have a little fun talking about this gentleman here. As, you know, I feel like when I look back at this season, injuries, Jim. I don't know if that might be a shocking revelation to you. Injuries, kind of something that we talk about. Mm-hmm. So availability was a big thing. The players that were available and able to play, I kind of feel had the most to do with the Pels having any kind of success or a chance to win. Mm-hmm. Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, was he available?
Yes, he was quite available. He played 66 games, which was second on the team. And honestly, I think that kind of cheats him a little bit of how much he was available because he did have some coaches' decision DMPs. So, I mean, I would think that if he, I think he was available for almost all of the games. I don't know if there was one game, maybe the injury stuff I went through has boggled my mind and corrupted my brain, but I want to say he was not even on the injury report that often. So, I mean, he could have easily played 80-something games. He was available and in uniform, I think, for something close to that, but he got into the 66 games. Yeah, unfortunately, this is becoming a bigger discussion just based on the reality of the way the NBA is going, that, games played is something that we talk about a lot more than we used to because there's been more injuries, not just with the Pelicans, but across the league. So I was curious. I wanted to kind of do some comparisons and look at, the Pelicans had two guys. It was just JRE and Yves Missi that met the minimum of 65 games played. Wanted to look at just for time's sake, didn't have time to look across the whole West or the whole league, but just the Pelicans division to just see how the Pelicans stacked up against some of those teams. And you can kind of see when you look at the availability of these other teams of what you were up against in terms of these other teams had players on the floor much more regularly than the Pelicans did. So Memphis had 7 players who played at least 65 games this season. And even though we think of them, of their season, I think rightfully so, that they were banged up and they had injuries, they still had 7 guys who played a huge chunk of the season. They had 2 guys that led the team in games played, Jalen Wells and Scottie Pippen Jr. both played 79. So, I mean, that's one team. The Spurs, also in the division, they had 5 guys that played at least 65 games. And this blows my mind. They had 3 guys who played 82 games. Chris Paul, Harrison Barnes, and Julian Champagnie all played in every single game this season. So you can contrast that to the Pelicans. Yves Missi led the team with 73 games played. Quite a difference. And then the last couple teams in the division in Texas, Houston had 4 guys that played at least 65 games, which I was surprised. I thought that would be higher. But Jalen Green played 82. Alperen Şengün played 76. Those 2 guys led them in games played. And then the Mavericks only had 3 guys who played 65 games, so they were hampered not as drastically as the Pelicans by injuries, but pretty significantly. Spencer Dinwiddie played 79 games, led them with that. And then Klay Thompson played 72. And then the third guy that played 65 or more for them was our guy Najee Marshall. So every other team in the division had at least one player who played 79 games. The Spurs had 3 guys that played 82. The Rockets had a starter in Jalen Green that played 82. You compare that to the numbers that I listed about the Pelicans, and you just see that's a huge gap as far as how much more some of these other teams had their best players on the floor compared to what New Orleans had.
Yeah, no doubt. And obviously, if you don't have your best players on the floor, it's going to be an uphill battle, man, to win. It just is what it is, for sure. Mr. John DeShazier, analyst for the radio side of your Pelicans, now joins us to talk a little bit about what he saw in JRE's season this year for the Birds. We welcome in analyst for the Pelicans Radio Network, Mr. John DeShazier, as we continue our player profiles. JD, always nice to see you, sir. Obviously, we've been talking about the playoffs in and out of the office. I'm paying attention. I'm watching what's going on here as well. Eventually, the Pels will be back in that postseason play here as well. But since it is post the regular season, we're talking about some of the players that did stand out. Jeremiah Robinson-Earl is a player you're going to talk about, and Carlo Matkovic, your 2 players for your player profiles. Starting with JRE. When I say Jeremiah Robinson-Earl, when I go from Nashville to now, here in the month of April, almost May, what stands out to you?
I mean, I think the word that comes to mind to me is somewhat solid, somewhat reliable. I mean, he's not a front of the rotation player, so I don't think you will have Jeremiah Robinson-Earl as one of your top 7, 8 players. But when you're talking about 9th player, 10th player, those kinds of guys who will stack up some DNP CDs, did not play coaches' decisions. But, if you get 3 of those, can that guy be ready to play on the 4th one, be ready to contribute? And I think he's one of those guys who stays ready, who can contribute, in that kind of role. I don't think he's, if JRE is playing 30 minutes and he's playing, 8 games in a row and he's starting 5 of them, I think you're probably, injury related. And I think you're probably, that's not a role you want him in, frankly. Mm-hmm. That's not where you see him. But is he a guy who can play in the NBA? Yeah, he's been in the NBA. Not only has he been in the NBA for 4 years, but I think the back end of this past season where the injuries did allow him to get on the floor a little bit more and play a few more minutes. You don't see stardom, but you see a guy that you say, okay, he can plug in situations where you got to have him, where you get in some foul trouble, where you get some injury and you need some injury relief. He's a guy that you can plug in those situations, and I don't think he will be a huge detriment to what you're trying to do, especially if you can surround him with some frontline guys. Now, if it's him and a bunch of guys who started the season in the G League, then it's going to look that way. Mm-hmm. But if it's him and it's some of your frontline guys, and he doesn't have to do more than he's capable of doing, or fit a role that you really don't have him structured for, then I think he can be a solid back of the rotation guy.
I mean, to some of your points, for example, if you look back at JRE's season, he played in the first 25 games of the season, which I don't think we would have necessarily predicted that going into the year. He also played the final 16 games as well. To me, I mean, how much of that, when you look at the season in terms of what he brought to the table, was just, I mean, for example, also, he and Yves Missi were the only 2 guys that played 65 games. So that's the number that you have to be eligible for minimum, for NBA awards. How much of that was just what he brought to the table in a year where you needed that pretty badly?
Yeah, I mean, you got guys injured, and so now one of the most important traits we always say is, your best ability is availability. And you got to have people to play, and so he's a guy who's available. And look, like I said, not a stardom guy, but last 11 games, he ends up with a couple double-doubles in there, but he averages 9.3 points, 6.5 rebounds. He shoots 46% from the field, 36% from 3. He plays 24 minutes. Again, you expand it out and you say, okay, this is a guy who I don't think necessarily, if he's in there with frontline guys, will hurt you that much. Again, he's not a starter guy who you want out there for 36 minutes. Mm-hmm. He reminds me a little bit of Kenrich Williams. Kenrich is 7 years into the league now. Who would have thought that?
Wow. Right.
He's 7 years in. Mm-hmm. Well, JRE's 4 years in, and it's like, man, these guys, there's a role for him. I don't think it will ever be, you need him to start 58 games, but when you get into situations where either guys are injured or resting, and you need to rely on that 8th or 9th guy, well, JRE has shown he'll rebound. He'll make some corner threes. We saw a little bit of expansion in this game down the stretch of the season where he make a couple of plays off the dribble, and it kind of shocked you because it'd be like, okay, I didn't know he had that in his bag. Mm-hmm. But you see a little bit of expansion in him, and so he's got some things that he can work with. He's never going to be. He's not super athletic. He's not huge. He's 6'9". He's not necessarily physically gifted where he's going to be jumping over people and that kind of thing. But he's solid. He's solid. And look, every NBA team needs solid guys somewhere along the roster because not everybody is going to be all-star caliber. And not everybody is going to be a 39% three-point shooter, but you got to have some guys who can just fill in the gaps when you got to have guys fill in the gaps because even when healthy, there are going to be some nights where you just get in foul trouble and you need a guy to give you 8-10 minutes.
Kenny Hustle, I think, is an interesting comparison. I mean, it's funny that both of those guys have only played for 2 teams. I guess Kenrich did kind of the opposite, where he started here and went to OKC, whereas JRE did the opposite of that. I thought JRE, there was a lot of times where his hustle and his rebounding were really valuable. And we're doing a segment every one of these podcasts where I talk to the guests about a couple numbers I'm going to throw at you, and these are JRE related numbers. You can tell me which one you want to talk about. Maybe you want to discuss both. The first number is 3.2, and that's offensive rebounds per 36 minutes for JRE, which ranked him second on the Pelicans. Only Yves Missi had a higher rate of creating second chances. JRE was also 19th among all NBA players who played in at least 65 games. He finished 19th in offensive rebounding per minute, so that was definitely a credit to him. Second stat was he had 15 games of double-digit scoring. The most he had in a game was 19 in a narrow loss against Golden State on November 22nd. In the previous season, he only had 3 games where he had double-figure scoring, so went from 3 to 15. So those are the two numbers, the 3.2 offensive rebounds per 36 minutes and then the 15 times that he had 10-plus points in a game.
I like the offensive rebounding number because that's a hustle number. That's a guy who recognizes who he is and what his value is. And his value is, okay, I got to hustle and go get the rebound. I got to hustle and go get the ball and give us another possession, give us an extra possession, an extra shot. And so that's kind of realizing this is who I am. This is how I can stick on this team. This is how I can contribute. And this is what gives me value. And so a lot of guys, I think, in the NBA don't necessarily understand what their value is because they won't necessarily accept their role. And so he says, this is my role. I can offensive rebound. I'm not the biggest guy in the world, but I can hustle. You can. That's one of those things where you can't chart hustle. That's one of those things where you get a guy in and you say, okay, he's got these measurables. Okay, and what else does he add? Well, he adds hustle. That's something you can't quantify, but that's something that's within him because he said, look, I can stick in this league if I hustle, if I rebound. That's value because you can't find a team in the NBA that doesn't want somebody who rebounds. Everybody wants somebody who rebounds and gets you extra possessions. So that's huge to me. Yeah. Now, the scoring, the double-figure scoring, also shows that he's worked on his offensive game. Because he doesn't get a whole lot of opportunities within the offense where they say, okay, we're going to run this pick and roll for JRE and we're going to get him a shot. That's not his offense. Yep. He is okay, when we're scrambling around and we got the defense on his heels, if they can get me the ball in the corner and I got an open look, I'll take that shot. Or I can get out on the fast break and maybe get a dunk or a layup, those kinds of things. So, it shows me that, again, a guy who works at his craft on offense because, again, he's worked on his three-point shooting. He takes more of them. But the thing that really makes a guy stick is when you're hustling like that for offensive rebounds because, again, it shows value. And it's one of those things that you can't quantify. You can say, well, I wish X guy would be a better rebounder. I wish Y guy would be a better rebounder. Well, this is a guy who says, look, this is the way I'm going to stick in the league probably. Mm-hmm. This is the way I'm going to be on a roster. I got to rebound. I got to do some stuff that other guys don't have to do because they're superstars and you don't hold them to that responsibility all the time. But my role when I go in is to do these things, to stir up a little something, to get us some extra possessions. And that's the value. Again, it's not a top 6, 7, maybe 8 rotation player value, but it's the value that keeps you on the team.
Lastly, from me on JRE, this team does not have that many free agents. He's one of them. I'm not going to ask you about that part of it, but what do you think either he improved the most this past season from the year before, or what do you think are kind of the next steps for him in terms of what he needs to continue to do, going forward in the rest of his career?
Well, he seems to be a pretty capable rebounder, and that's one of those things that, you'll continue to be. When guys rebound, they just rebound. So he's got to probably be a little bit better scorer, a little bit more consistent. And I say that, and that's hard to do when you don't play consistent minutes. So, if you're playing 2 minutes here and 3 minutes there, or you're not playing for 3 consecutive games, your opportunities kind of withering, and it's like when you get out there, you got to do something because you don't know the next time you're going to be out there. Mm-hmm. So it's like sometimes guys in that situation press a little bit because they're like, I don't know when I'm going to play again. And so now how do you become a consistent shooter when you don't get the minutes to really be a consistent shooter, because you really don't have time to play through your mistakes. You're one of those guys who's just kind of a relief guy, a relief pitcher. And so, you mess up once or twice and you're going back to the bench, whereas a frontline guy, you mess up once or twice and you get 6 more minutes behind that to kind of make up for it. But he's not a guy who's probably going to get those opportunities unless there's a lot of injuries. So, you want to see him, even in that circumstance, hopefully be a little bit more consistent shooter. You want to see him expand beyond the corner three because he's kind of got that down. But you got to be able to make some wing threes because those are open shots for him. And I don't necessarily know that he's ever going to be a great post player. He just doesn't seem comfortable with that. But you can, because he's Jeremiah Robinson-Earl. And all due respect, not a lot of people are going to guard him. Right. In situations. They're going to say, okay, he's a guy, we don't mind taking a shot. So when that happens, you got to be able to take advantage of those opportunities. And those are the things, again, that keep you on the floor if you can take advantage of those opportunities.
It's interesting that you say that because in doing these player profiles, we've talked with Wes Johnson and other people that have either played or cover it as well as you, JD, and roles and where your role is and fit. It's something that we've talked about throughout the season. It's just listening to you just now, though, how important or how key is it to understand maybe part of that role of fit is, hey, I got this other talent here, and to your point, I'm going to be left alone, so I need to work on a catch-and-shoot three or something. In other words, things that I work in, quote-unquote, the lab in the offseason pertain specifically to the team you're on, the talent you're on, the role you're going to be used on, right? If it's hey, you're coming in here, Jim, and we want 5 rebounds from you. So my lab work this summer is posting and blocking out as opposed to shooting. You understand what I'm saying? Like for JRE?
See, that's those lonely, uncharted minutes in the offseason that guys are just working on their craft. And so you realize you got to be real with yourself and understand what your limitations are and what your weaknesses are. And if you are, then you can attack those. You can say, okay, they give me wide open looks from the key and from the wings, because they know I can shoot a little bit from the corner. So when I'm at the key and I'm at the wing, I'm on the wings, they are not guarding me. So I've got to become a threat there to make myself more valuable. It's just like if they're guarding you and playing you to go right all the time, you got to learn how to go left sometimes, unless you're Zion, and they can't stop you from going left regardless. but you got to be able to say, okay, I got to be able to diversify and build up my weakness, because some guys aren't Superman to where you can overcome the things that ordinarily would be limitations. I mean, look, think about the history of the NBA. Some guys who, again, like Zion, I use Zion for an example. He's going left. You know it, and you can't stop it. There's nothing you can do about it. Well, not every guy has that ability to be able to say, okay, I'm going left, I'm going to point left to where I'm going, and you know exactly where I'm going, and I'm going to get to that spot, and I'm going to score. Not everybody can do that. So when you're one of the guys who can't do that, you better be able to beef up the other things that you don't do well and make them, if not strengths, certainly not glaring weaknesses to where people just disrespect you and don't guard you.
What you said about Zion going left reminds me of watching youth basketball where there's kids that can only dribble right and the defense forces them that way. They're willing to dribble into the parking lot if they need to because that's right. So, yeah. But, it's incredible to have that ability where you can do it and they can't stop you anyways. But, yeah, it just, I don't know, just a random note that just cracked me up.
Those are special people, and not everybody can do that. So you got to be able to realize, okay, he can do that, but I can't do that. I don't have that. So what can I do? What can I do that will make my game a little bit better? Well, you know what? Instead of shooting 23% on wing threes, if I can get that up to 33, 35, okay, now that's a lot more valuable, because now you space the floor out. You open the floor up, because now people say, okay, we can't just leave him there and let him shoot. We actually got to challenge him because he makes enough of those to where it's effective.
And I guess finally, as we wrap up here on this roster, barring injuries, right, you have a lot of talent there already. So those minutes, to the point you brought up, they're going to be limited. So you have to make the most, maximize those minutes. And I think that's the key when we look at Jerry this summer going into next year.
Yeah, and he's a guy who, look, this is the NBA. And unfortunately, especially for this franchise, maybe I should knock wood right now, you have injuries. for whatever reason, guys get injured, and so guys like him have to be ready to play when the injuries come, because unfortunately, that's just the reality of the NBA. You got a lot of games, you got a lot of minutes, you got guys who get injured, and so that 9th guy on your roster, that 10th guy on your roster, one day he wakes up and he's the 7th guy in the rotation, and now he's not only, he's not watching, he's got to play. He ain't cheerleading anymore. He's got to take off the warm-ups, and he's got to go out there and play. So you got to be ready.
John DeShazier, analyst for your New Orleans Pelicans radio network. Appreciate the time on our player profile of Jeremiah Robinson-Earl. Our thanks to Mr. John DeShazier. It's always a pleasure when he stops on by. And more importantly, when he gets that animated and excited about Jerry. I can think of all the different calls for sure. Look, man, I think of Jerry, some big threes, some big moments in the season to help win the games that the Pels got to win this season. And I guess that's how we look at this year, man. When we look at all these player profiles, there's so many different storylines attached to it. But for some of those guys that got the minutes, got a chance to do something, sometimes they produce, man.
Yeah, he really did. I mean, he's gotten sporadic chances to play. This is his 4th season in the NBA with OKC and with New Orleans. He's been kind of a spot minutes guy. He's not going to be starting every single game. He's not necessarily going to be in the rotation every night. But, I mean, he's shown some good stuff in the chances he's gotten to play. And he really was on the floor a ton in March and April when, they had some games where they only suited up 8 or 9 guys, and everybody that was in uniform knew they didn't have to look over their shoulder. They were going to play a lot of minutes that night.
Oh, looking over your shoulder. I don't know about you. You might have heard of this or not as we take a look at the playoffs here. It's the Western Conference, Eastern Conference. So second round about to kind of start. Some teams have already advanced. Others have not. One team whose season has come to a end, Mr. J.
Yeah, we weren't going to pass up
what
the
a
opportunity
shame.
to talk about this.
What a
Their
terrible
season coming
shame.
to an end. As I've pointed out recently, we definitely pride ourselves on being the most objective reporting on the Lakers possible. But it was such an interesting series against the Timberwolves, and I think Minnesota impressed me so much with the way that they were able to kind of expose some of the holes that the Lakers have in their roster. Now, in fairness to the Lakers, I like to be fair to the Lakers. You definitely have to say that the team that they had this year is not what they were planning on having. I mean, they thought that they were going to have Mark Williams in a trade from Charlotte. They rescind the trade. Now they have a huge hole at center to the point where in Game 5 of the series that ended the year for the Lakers, they didn't even have a center in the starting lineup, and J.J. Redick pretty much barely played centers to any extent. Jared Vanderbilt got some minutes in Game 5, but that was really the closest they came to having what you would call a big. But, I mean, the Timberwolves were able to just batter them on the boards. So I think that's going to be something that LA is going to focus on a lot in the offseason. But I don't think I was necessarily shocked that Minnesota won, but I definitely was surprised that it happened so quickly, that it was only a 5-game series. And one of the things that I tweeted out after the game on Wednesday night, I know, Gus, you're going to be surprised that I you could accuse me of rubbing it in a little bit here, maybe.
Okay.
But I tweeted that the Lakers were the first 3 seed to lose in the first round in 5 games or less since 2018 when Portland was swept by the Pelicans. So just kind of a funny coincidence. I mean, if you think about it, the 3 seed usually wins. There aren't that many 6 seeds that advance in the first round, period. But the fact that the T-Wolves were able to do it in 5 games was definitely unique in recent NBA history. There have not been many 6 seeds that have won. There have not been many 3 seeds that didn't at least get out of the first round. And if a team like Sacramento was a 3 seed a couple years ago, they got knocked out. But it took Game 7, Steph Curry having 50 points in Game 7 to win in Sacramento to knock that Kings team out. So the fact that this series was over in 5 games, I think, is definitely something that was interesting to note and a bit surprising. But LeBron's 40, so we'll see what happens. We'll see what moves they make. It's not like they can be on a 3 to 5 year timeline and say, we're playing for the future. I'm sure they're gonna do everything they possibly can to go all in on next season and every year that he's on the roster still.
Let's see what happens. It's gonna be an interesting offseason all the way around the NBA as the playoffs continue. Any surprises so far for you? You thinking?
No, I think that's probably been the biggest one. Is just the.
But remember, that was a T-Wolves team that a lot of people last year, they were saying Anthony Edwards is going to be the next face. That they were comparing him to Jordan, right? I mean, so it just took a while because they made a trade in the offseason and it almost took them 2/3 of the season to find who they were. And a little bit different, right, with Julius Randle?
You know, they had a really good regular season last season too, so I don't want to make it seem like they're a team that always comes out of nowhere and then does well in the playoffs, but it does seem like with their style of play that maybe this is a team that going forward in the postseason is going to be one that year in and year out you don't want to face. It does seem like the way the game slows down and the way that physicality amps up to have a bigger team the way that they do and to have the athleticism and the depth is maybe it's a bigger advantage in the playoffs than it is in the regular season because, I mean, they had a good regular season. It wasn't great, but I mean, I still think that, you know, they did this against Denver in the playoffs last year too. They were able to really pick apart and expose the weaknesses of a really quality team that they played. Last year it was the second round against Denver. This year it's the first round against the Lakers.
All right, Mr. Jim Eichenhofer, Pelicans.com. Again, if you miss any of these interviews, you can always just go to Pelicans.com or anywhere you get the podcast. They're all listed there. We're doing 14 total player profiles. And on Pelicans.com, Jim has a accompanying written piece to go with it as well, a little bit more detail. So go and check that out. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Gus.
All right, and thank you for tuning us in. You've been listening to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans podcast. Join us 3 times per week on Pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcast. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhofer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans podcast.